meeting because 21 years, this was the first church I walked into in New York City, and I'm happy that now this is the first sort of public outside of my academic life event, and it's taking place here as well. So I'm grateful to everyone who has helped putting this together, and Jesse, you, and everyone in the room, and I see a lot of friends and colleagues on Zoom, so we're trying this high flex, that's what we call it these days. But I'll jump right into it. Jesse, thanks for a wonderful introduction. So I didn't know I did all those things, but I am an economist. So I will be talking a little bit about, as much as possible, simplified, but really some technical matters, and I'll try to glide through them very quickly. Because I'm also well familiar with technical issues. So the audience in the Zoom session, if you have any problems somehow, please indicate, maybe in the chat room, we'll try to keep an eye on that. So right into it, Jesse has suggested that if you are going to talk about diaspora, make it somehow relevant with the context. So we put the word homeland in it, and it completely changed everything that I wanted to say. And then certain other recent events, which I will mention shortly through the presentation, have also influenced what's happening there. But as Jesse mentioned, the general regional focus of Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union is one of the driving sort of forces and currents in my research. So I work a lot on that. And diaspora or migration, those are just applied concepts for me. And I view them within the context of sort of bigger picture of macroeconomic development. Now, what we mean by that, this is something that we'll probably be able to discover. And the talk is based on a series of academic papers, so that's what I will have listed because, again, for the Zoom audience, some of the details are better visible than for friends here. Okay, so now the clicker is, I'll just keep moving back and forth. Oh no, it's because it was set on Zoom. Okay, so for those on Zoom, and not to our times, if you're live tweeting, go ahead and use those hashtags. Diaspora engagement, transition economies, and least but most important, not last but not the least, is the diaspora bomb, on topics that will come up today. Last year, right before the tragedy of October, I was working with one of my former students from St. John's, and we were just sitting down to reflect on the situation in this macroeconomic situation, sort of how the small economy is doing, because for those of us following this very closely across the world and looking at the comparative picture, we noticed that the problems that we're hearing about today were already evident back then. So supply chain interruptions, or small economies being thrown off sort of the path of steady development, all sorts of specific problems. So we came up with 4 ideas, and then I added a 5th. Small economies, and you can guess which one I had in mind most of all at the time of writing, and again, that was in August and September of last year. We said maybe there's a potential to just follow the 1950s type of program of big push, and that is all systems go, all industries develop, just fund them somehow and become South Korea of some type. Another option is to integrate in terms of trade, directions, connections in terms of investment with the largest trading partner. So this would be either regional or, well, China is present even in Africa and Latin America, so it could be also based on economic connection. The third was to just leave things as they were. And the fourth is they form a union of small nations. But this is one of those utopian ideas that economists sometimes do. And the fifth now is the diaspora. And this is one, and I'm really grateful seeing some people in the Zoom session who will, and I hope I'll do proud, I'll make them proud by making some critical remarks about the diaspora and what we mean by diaspora, because it turns out, again, for Zoom, it's much more visible. But it turns out the diaspora word in itself, right, the way we use it, is a very unique and new concept. in the context of business studies, in the context of economic development. Even more so, there's sort of an occasional, once-in-a-decade discovery of the diaspora. And the person we must learn from about this is Dr. Hachik Tolonian, who's been an immense influence for me on this topic. I'm grateful to see him in the audience in the Zoom. So thank you. But this is exactly what is going on as far as current interpretation of diaspora in the business world, business studies. There are books, there are academic papers, policy papers published saying that, well, when everything else fails, diaspora will save us. And sure, it can be the fifth element sort of in the development. This was done as a comparative study for Armenia and Georgia. Sure, diaspora can be developed, can be this, so I said the fifth element, right? One of those push factors, but I need to bring me back into PowerPoint. And there's no lack of models that being discussed at a very serious levels as far as the potential, the sort of diaspora networks, and everybody's pointing to the Chinese networks, the Indian networks, how they've grown, how they've brought back business to their respective countries. When it comes to remittances, the literature and academic people, academics studying business studies or working in policy think tanks, multilateral organizations pointing to, well, look at the success of Mexico and hometown associations formed by migrants from Mexico, sending money back home, building entire schools and villages and such. Then there's continues since 20 years ago, at least, since it's become more of a system about writing on the potential about diaspora. There's continuous talk about the skills and knowledge transfer, so the soft skills. And people are searching for what are the best models for that, and naturally pointing at certain steps that the governments have to do. Most recently, you may have heard, Armenia announced an interest in exploring capacity for issuing a diaspora bond. So we'll talk a little bit about that, because diaspora bond is something I've worked on for the past 15 or so years. And when I started working on it, it was, nobody really cares about it. It's just one of those, again, intellectual exercises, drop it. We thought about it in the 90s, it's not going to work. Now, in the case of Armenia, again, before the war, much of the diaspora involvement was pushed towards repatriation. But we should not sort of, let's put this, we should be really honest with ourselves, because for many people, it's not a repatriation, but really immigration in the context of Armenia, but also very true for other countries. So let's start with remittances and some graphs. All you need to see in the audience here, and those in Zoom, you can actually read more. You can see better picture there. It is that remittances do matter. They are very significant. They add up to 30, in some cases 40. These are averages. So in a specific year for a country like Tajikistan, for example, Kyrgyzstan, remittances, those transfers sent by labor migrants would reach 30 to 40% of their GDP, or the size of their economy. So that's quite significant. Basically says 40% of the economy really exists on remittances. For Armenia, it used to be a very significant percentage. Now it's a little bit smaller, around 10 or so. Varies, of course. And this is fine as sort of a factor that helps eliminate this, eradicate this extreme poverty. But remittances have a massive flowing built into them, which could be summarized in the context of they're very individual. The scale of remittances is usually small. $500 is on average a month sent by a labor migrant. Anything more than that will, for formal reasons and accounting, will be made registered as remittances, but it really is just a one-time transfer, $1,000 for donations that everybody made, or most people made in October of last year. Really what we're talking about here is something that has become more of a, on a global level, more of a consistent factor that shows steady increase. And that's how labor migration became a popular thing to talk about in the multilateral world, when remittances hit $100 billion globally, and these days they're about 600 billion. And all of a sudden the world woke up and said, wait, so that's what those people are doing. They go across borders and they send money back home. And there is now strong support among some development economists for this idea of remittances being sort of the savior of the day. It's if we could only capture and leverage this potential remittances, then the small countries will be able to benefit from this, because the small countries, they're not really on the map of large investors, unless there's some speculative, for example, in the mining sector or precious stones or something like that, opportunity for those investors. Right, so scale, the individuality of remittances, that it's really about a labor migrant sending money back home to family. And there's another sort of direction and discussion in economic development journals about, well, we really need to emphasize the common good. How does the community back home gain from the fact that remittances are being sent back and forth? Well, being received, really. And then, of course, the big question is, well, what is development? Is it just eradication of poverty, which is extremely important, and it is extremely important problem for a country like Armenia. But what I want to say is that Armenia is not the only one. In fact, there are others. Again, maybe hard to see on this screen, but those in Zoom will clearly see it. This is obviously meant for a bigger screen. But what's circled in here is just a, if I can guide you to that, is just a collection of countries in Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union that potentially have large diasporas, right? So potentially, if they have those large diasporas, they should be benefiting like no other from those remittances. There should be, we should see concrete evidence of diaspora engagement with those countries, because, well, in a business journal, I read that diasporas are by definition altruistic and will help out in times of trouble. It turns out that's not the case. So we're measuring here the income level. So the further to the right, the richer is the country. So in this case, what's circled are sort of low income economies. And on the which one is this vertical axis, we have the combined share of remittances and foreign direct investment. So clearly then, well, at least in my opinion, clearly, just having a diaspora or just having a group of expatriates or some type of people with cultural affiliation to the home country, which may be referred to as a diaspora with some approximation, is not enough to draw substantial funding money, right, which will go towards infrastructure projects, educational projects, healthcare projects, or supporting any type of industries, because really collectively all that is development. So, but still in business studies, there's, again, proliferation of this literature. And led me to just say we're creating this diasporization problem because we're just looking for a band-aid solution, and a lot of those studies are based on individuals of cases. So let's look at 10 people from this village. Let's look at 20 people from that village. Or let's just all become like China, because expatriate Chinese are investing back, well, in the 90s, we're investing back significantly, and now even more, and so on. So my really main point out of this slide, many words, but really main point is that diaspora cannot be a substitute for systemic measures of development. Okay, so that's sort of the bottom line, the floor from which we have to start. Diaspora is great, wonderful. Maybe we're all diasporans, I don't know, but it's not a substitute. It needs to be connected with countries' development. And for this, a little bit of macroeconomic update. Just a few weeks ago, we finished a paper with my co-author on topic of poverty, 30 years in transition, poverty, 30 years in transition. And this picture shows the degree to which some of the former Soviet Union economies, the smaller economies, suffered in the 90s, around there. All right. And you can see how Georgia was actually hit much worse, losing up to 70%, rounding up, of its economic output. Tajikistan was next, and Armenia is with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th, right, somewhere up to 40%. Now, what does this mean? Imagine the economy is functioning, going well, and then all of a sudden, 40% of that economy just disappears. When I give these type of talks in Armenia, the first thing I always say is that Armenia is not even Georgia. We have to remember when we complain, this was of course before last year, but when we talk about Armenia's specific context, we have to remember that there were other countries that also suffered much worse, and they're still recovering. And before 2020, again, let's just also set this separated line. Before 2020, Armenia was actually doing much better than its peers in the former Soviet Union space. In fact, up until 2019, what's ever circled in red here has countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Tajikistan, still catching up to the horizontal line, which goes like this, which was the income level of 1989. And I can come back to any of these busy charts. I understand that not everyone is an economist in the world. So, but basically the idea is to show here is that the economic destruction was real for all countries and for each individual, right, in different ways. But some were more successful in recovering and catching up to the pre-transition levels. And that's a combination of factors. For Eastern Europeans, it's actually the geography. It helps to be in Europe, but also the fact that their productive capacity, industrial capacity, was much more recent. I actually have something in Financial Times arguing that, saying basically that it was the 1950s industrialization done in a humane way compared to 1930s, if you will, which created more or less a recent and more upgrade a technological factor, which played for and helped countries like Poland and Czech Republic and Hungary to integrate with supply chains of Europe. It's a very different case when we talk about former Soviet Union countries. So please don't ask me to compare Armenia to the following: not to Estonia, not to Israel, not to South Korea, and not to Singapore. Those are not valid comparisons. We will not get anything out of that. It's a very different context. Okay, moving forward very fast. In more recent year, what we learned is that there's also a problem with how we responded across different countries to the pandemic. And one interesting statistic that we dug out was a comparative sort of picture, this one, that shows the number of hospital beds per 1,000 people in each country in the Soviet times, 1980, versus 2014. And the data is very difficult to get, right? So this is what we found in the World Bank statistics. If you have better data, that's great. But in any case, the dark bars represent 1980, much stronger situation. But with the privatization, which was, again, not unique to Armenia, it's the process of shock therapy and such affected all of the countries, and the former Soviet Union specifically, led to sort of decrease in hospital capacity and healthcare systems capacity, and something that we're, if you're following the news, we're learning from Armenia. Okay, so that's this one. Looking at it, and this is one last big picture sort of slide, and looking at another big picture last year, something also to keep in mind for us is that Armenia is considered to be an emerging market, tiny, small country, and even if that really. And in the collective group of transition economies, what was reported was a massive outflow of foreign capital. Now, when foreign capital leaves the country, it creates foreign exchange pressures, or simply speaking, the currency starts to lose value from a regular person on the street. From a perspective of business or a business person or entrepreneur and such, and from the perspective of the government, that means there's not enough dollars now, and they're just running away, and there's this risk of a bank run and a massive financial crisis. So this was reported very early on last year, and the IMF moved in very quickly to stabilize the situation, right? What helped Armenia at the time was that most of its debt was really what we call multilateral. In other words, it's coming from places like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and such, and less so from you and me, individual investors. Well, this is about to change. So and again, I had a completely different thing in mind when Jesse and I spoke about this idea first. I was just going to go into conceptual diaspora stuff, but then just a week ago or so, we heard that the diaspora bond, so we have to talk about it, I think. So can diaspora bonds solve the problem? Basically, if Armenia announces that we're borrowing from the diaspora, I'm not going to ask it to, I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, but you have to think about yourself, how much are you willing to invest? This is not a donation. In the end, you're promised some interest within 5 years, within 10 years, right? Something like this. Well, right now, actually, you can buy and invest in Armenia's government paper. It's called Treasury, just like the US Treasury. And there's an app, I haven't tested it, but my friends have. And especially if you have an Armenian passport, it becomes easy. Well, there's like 1% or 2% that are foreign investors buying those treasuries. It's mostly for the local market just to balance what's going on with it. But don't get me into trouble asking very controversial questions. I'm just stating the facts. I'm just looking at certain someone in the audience. Back to the diaspora bond. We all know or heard something about Israel. Sure, but besides Israel, there was India, and there were others. And there are certain things that we think we know about Israel's diaspora bond program, and that's borrowing from the diaspora specifically. But it turns out we don't know all of it. So let me talk through them very quickly. Is it this year? Israel is celebrating its 70th anniversary of issuing diaspora bonds, borrowing from the diaspora. Massive program, amounts to, I had a number somewhere, and of course I took it out. 16% of government's external debt in 2019, which is significant, right? And it's mostly borrowing in foreign currency, 94%. And since 1951, since the first issue, Israel was able to bring in 44 billion. And this is pretty much where it ends for a lot of people when they talk about diaspora bonds. And then there's fine print. In 1992, when after the collapse of the Soviet Union and massive inflow of Jewish immigrants from the Soviet Union to Israel, the US government offered a guarantee, $10 billion from 1993 to 1998, which was extended recently to $9 billion from 2000 up until 2023, from 13 to 2023. This is significant. This means to a foreign investor that Israel cannot really default on, or at least there's some guarantee of financial backing of such an important financial actor on the global scene, something that it has a reserve currency, and that's the US economy. Israel issued its bonds also registering in New York, which means there's much more rights that are given to individual investors. So this worked. These are the technical details that people in finance will know if they read again fine print in one of those annual publications. But Israel has done much more than this. They also worked with their diaspora. In 1951, the Israeli leadership went to New York, traveled across the world, trying, and these were the first people right in the country, the forming country, meeting with businessmen, meeting with community leaders, trying to figure out, well, what can we do to attract more funding into the country? And that actually was the beginning of what I would call the marketing campaign, because the whole system has evolved significantly and has become extremely flexible. If you go to the Development Preparation for Israel website, you'll see how you can buy a fraction of those bonds. And if you don't want to hold until the maturity, in other words, until there's the promised date of the bond's repayment, you can donate the bond to your favorite university. You can donate the bond to someone's pension. You can transform it into any other financial instrument which will benefit someone else. And this is a massive, well, I'll just stay with the moral and altruistic sort of factor that plays an incredible role in still sort of bringing in the diaspora investment to Israel. In the case of India, they tried three diaspora bonds. But for India, the relationship with diaspora was not that simple. They really discovered the fact that they had diaspora in the early 90s, and they called them non-resident Indians collectively, but they were also overseas Indians, so other categories. In all three cases, India issued those bonds in times of crisis, whether sanctions or nuclear weapons tests or foreign exchange, again, dollars were leaving the country. And unlike Israel, they did not issue them in New York. They issued them through their banking system. And it was a success on the scale of India, but it was not something that would be repeated. By then, Indian diaspora has already transformed into its own player in India's economy. That's where the discovery of the diaspora comes from. So what happened though, that this connection transformed into the banking system, allowing non-resident Indians to make easier transfers back home, connections with the families. The families could go to, recipients could go to the banks, receive the hard currency, the dollars or whatever, British pounds, and so on. Others, and let me skip this one just in the interest of time, but I can come back to this. Others have tried, and you may have read something about Nigeria, but that worked only once just recently, and Nigeria is 97% or so oil exporter. There's 97% of its exports of oil, so that's by definition, that's an attractive investment for a foreign investor. But other countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, have not been able to sort of bank on their diaspora. And most prominently, in terms of unfortunate failures, has been Greece. You may recall the Greek financial crisis, and so Greece, this whole thing with Greece leaving the EU and such potential. Well, this was when they thought they could raise $3 billion, and diaspora will certainly help us out because it's Greece, it's the nationhood at stake. Nope, it didn't work out. It's not enough to have this altruistic appeal. It has to be something else. Well, a brief comment. Oh, there's someone has a message, so we have to. This was you, Joseph. You distracted me. Okay, so a brief comment though on some work that I did with. There's another Gevorkyan there. He's also in the audience today. So something we did more than 10 years ago. We looked at migration and we said maybe migration is sort of ad hoc, labor migration specifically. Perhaps there's a way to capture it and have the diaspora centers participate in this. And so I can come back to this very complex chart, but the idea was to have in the host economy a diaspora center which will welcome the migrant and help them adapt to this new reality, help them find jobs and so on. But as a financial side to this would be a migration development bank now, which will help transfer funds back home. And it's all done legally because there will be bilateral agreement. And through those transfers, help develop the domestic economy, which by itself will then gradually will bring the need to migrates to the end. Because I tell my students, migration is not something that's done out of luxury, unless of course you have a private plane and you can afford it. We watch documentaries about La Bestia. I don't know if you know what that is. That's the train that passes across Mexico, and people walking through Central America jump on this train, which leads them to the northern border of Mexico and doesn't stop, right? So imagine what happens when people try to get on and get off the train. There's a reason why people would risk their lives. And it's not, again, out of luxury, there are economic, political, and other pressures. So if we can figure out how to finance development, that might help. Well, we wrote this sometime 10, 11, 12 years ago. There's one country that's actually doing this, and it's Moldova in the post-Soviet space. And Moldova has, of course, again, it's much closer to European Union and much involved. Similar culture, but also common language with Romanian, very close to Italian. So you find a lot of Moldovans in Italy. And for them, the concept of diaspora is 30 years old. Really. It's not one of the classical diasporas, which Armenia is, with Greeks and Jewish diaspora, with other two, right? And what Moldovans have done, they started creating government-led hometown associations, similar to what the Mexican diaspora did by by themselves, or Mexican migrants, Moldovans working with the government, working with the UN, European Union, and the migrants, started forming those hometown associations, which then unite those migrants. And a lot of Moldovan migrants are determined to go back because they see how their money through another dedicated program are going back to the towns and villages where they're from. And they have a say in where the money is going to, how the money is going to be spent. It's not just to their family, but it's actually to some, to organized pool fund, which then builds roads, schools for their brothers, sisters, and immediate family left back home. For a region in Moldova, apparently they have more than 100 regions, and it's a tiny Moldova. For a region in Moldova to be a recipient and benefiting from this program, they must appoint a contact person dealing with diaspora, right? So imagine this across Armenia's margins if you want to apply this term. So it's essentially working as this migration development back, which I have in this picture. But back to diaspora, it's not the technical part, remember. It's not just that, it does help, of course. Guarantee that Israel got from the US government helps. Borrowing at low rates, well, the interest rates are low now. But diaspora bond is really about the diaspora because remittances also don't cut. The remittances are too sporadic and not sufficient. And for that, we need to look very quickly. So I put together my slides in such a way that hopefully I'm drawing your attention to what's in red. Okay, so just focus on those things. And when we talk about diaspora, right, we need to understand who we are. What is a diaspora? How do we define it? How do we see it? And how do we convert this individual, I care about the country, I care about my family back home, into a common good? Well, how does actually build, integrates into this bigger strategy of economic development, social development, and such. So in using the United Nations terminology, it's the sustainability process. Okay, so to know the diaspora, maybe some of you may have seen this some years ago before, and I closed it in 2018. I launched this survey. Right? I called it Armenian Diaspora Online Survey. Do not confuse this with the Gevorkyan survey. Mine was about the economic questions, and maybe some of you wrote those pleasant comments saying that I was too obnoxious asking so many questions. So in any case, I've got 500 responses that this was good enough, and we closed it. And sorry, you can see probably, but for Zoom folks, you can see that this is just a selection of some answers. For example, how likely are you to move to Armenia? 40% say very likely. No, I'm sorry, not likely. One, looking at one, right? So we're dealing with 1 and 2 people who are, we're fine where we are. Don't push us to do things. But at the same time, what this one says is that we are also happy to engage with Armenia in the way of, and I'm an academic, so that's what I thought, lecturing, knowledge sharing. But in the other, there's an option for other. And another question, people wrote about many things. I'm a hockey coach, I can do this. Or I'm an engineer and I can work with engineers in Armenia. I'm an architect and I'm happy to work with architects. I'm an editor, I can help edit things. Now all responses are anonymous, so I don't know those people. But to me, so many responses pretty much pushing, indicating one thing, that there's a motivation, there is an interest to engage, suggests that, well, we need to open the door somehow. One of the obstacles for engagement was the lack of funds. And a lot of people say, I can't travel to Armenia because I don't have money, I'm retired, for example, or a student, or just in general, I'm not really interested in travel. So there's a diversity of answers, and when I talk only about the survey, there's much more. I've tried to describe it in my articles briefly, but basically let me try to put this in. There's also a very interesting gender related results. Western Armenian women have lower income than Eastern Armenian women living in the United States, which was interesting. I don't know how to interpret this one, but I'll leave it for after the conversation, after the presentation.
Okay, I need my controls.
What it comes back to, though, and this was made very clear in the survey answers, is the trust. So to me, if we talk about diaspora and development, and then from the financial side, this speculative idea of the diaspora bond, well, we have to define the diaspora. We have to understand why remittances don't really matter that much. But lastly, it's all about the trust. And Jesse mentioned this about in the introduction, what happened to the money, right? Well, for trust, what goes into the definition of diaspora is that we're a product of several waves of migration, right? And diaspora is a product of migration, but it's a product of historical migration. So we have old diaspora, new diaspora, and since 1990s, it's become all mixed. We have Armenians from the Soviet Union, not from Armenia, who never thought of themselves as being diasporas. And then they turn out here in New York or somewhere else, and it turns out they are part of the diaspora. And it's difficult psychological sort of realization, but also messes up your self-identification in some ways. What we do have is something from what I heard many, many years ago in one of the events is the concept of dispersion, which when I first heard it, I completely rejected it. I said, how could you even say this? We are all united. But actually that is true. And it goes back to the original definition of the diaspora. It's the fact that people are spread sort of fan across the world. But also these days across different social layers, different transnational identities. That's the common phrase these days to use, right? And we assume them in many different ways. But still, can we somehow capture this potential? Because survey results indicate people might be interested. And for that, we need some type of an engagement infrastructure, or diaspora engagement infrastructure. It's my technical word to this. Well, one way to engage with diaspora is to have some type of a representative office. Moldova has a diaspora bureau for that. Now, there was another publication recently coming out of Armenia asking, well, have you ever heard about this or that diaspora? Actually, yes. I learned a lot from people who are organizing Irish diaspora. It's called the Ireland Fund. And they're very serious about bringing together global Irish. Ireland as a country funds any organization across the world that will help promote Irish culture. I mean, it could be you. If you have an organization and you're looking for funding, do something. Greece invented a diaspora day. My Irish colleagues say Armenia has to come up with a St. Patrick's Day for Armenia. And then the rest of the world will celebrate. In other words, I think what's holding us is that we keep going back to some of our conservative thinking, let's put it this way, about our history and such. It doesn't mean we have to neglect this, so don't misinterpret my words. But it is saying something that we need to be more flexible and create some sort of formal ways of connecting with diaspora. Giving sort of my debts to current times and technology and such. In one of the articles, I said, let's have a website. Let's think about it as match.com. We just call it diaspora portal. Well, I wrote that in 2018-19. Actually, Scotland has a thing called Global Scot. Estonia has a Global Estonian or something like this, friend of Estonians, by which you can actually become an electronic resident of European Union and to run your business and others. But I think for everyone, what should be surprising really is the Scottish example, because why would Scotland be doing this? But they have two networks. There's one that's sponsored by the government, and there's another that is the other that is run by businesses. I'll skip the chart, but I'm happy to come back to this. Is what I do to impress economists, to say that learning and working on diaspora actually makes sense within theoretical economics. If you want, I can come back. But it is really complicated in terms of this mutual connection approaching the end. The mutual connection that should be established if we're serious about diaspora for development and homeland. Examples from Mexico suggest, for instance, that too much of the diaspora becomes a bit of a problem because diaspora organizations tend to acquire certain influence among people in rural areas, especially and such, because of personal connections. Well, this is where there's a conflict between what the government wants to do, and this is documented for Mexico, for example, where the government wants to do and what the diaspora view is, right? So they have, the government might want to control certain financial flows, as simple as that. And the members of the diaspora disagree with this, right? And or there may be a political decision, right, against something like this. And this is where the diaspora withdraws the funds, but that creates an economic problem back home and then backfires at the government and such. The discovery of diasporas was accidental at some point, but I think it will last for a little bit. But don't let anyone tell you that other countries don't have a diaspora or it is some type of a sign of malfunction of the system. Diaspora is a product of migration. I mean, if New Zealand talks about its diaspora, surely there's something that there is there. But to conclude, basically, what we need to agree on is something of a clear economic strategy. And I go back to the 4 or 5 points that I started with. What it is that we're trying to achieve in economic terms. You guys can discuss politics, but for me, in economic terms, we need to achieve a decent level of living standard, right, if we talk about Armenia specifically. And yes, diaspora can play a role in this. And there's 3 factors to keep in mind. It's the competitive makeup of the economy. It's the institutional change. And institutional does not mean sort of buzzwords, democracy this or transparency that. No, it's actually the practicality of working out any questions on the ground. Okay. And the third is the social well-being. In other words, how people feel themselves being in Armenia. Is there a feeling of accomplishment or lack of it? And well, then we'll know how to build a connection with the diaspora. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I can certainly go on. Thank you for your attention and those in Zoom. Thanks.